Chapter 1: A Scar in the Valley. The valley held its breath. Rain, a constant Welsh companion, had paused its assault, leaving the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet earth and crushed ferns. Dr. Kenji Tanaka stood on the edge of the excavation pit, a rectangular wound of raw soil carved into the green hillside. Below him, students and volunteers scraped away centuries with trowels and brushes, their movements slow and deliberate in the humid air. The skeleton of a Roman villa was emerging, its stone foundations a pale grid against the dark mud. It was a good sight, a promising sight. It had to be. Anything from the GPR, Ben. Kenji directed his voice towards the technical tent, a white nylon bubble against the sea of green and gray. Ben Carter emerged, shielding a tablet screen from the glare of the overcast sky. His face, usually a mask of youthful eagerness, was scrunched in concentration. "We have a persistent anomaly, Kenji. Right under the main atrium's floor level, it's deep. Deeper than any cellar I have seen in a villa of this period. And the density is odd. It's not a void, it's structured." Kenji descended the makeshift wooden steps into the pit, his boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. He walked to the center of the villa's footprint, where a grad student was meticulously clearing soil from a patch of mosaic. The tiles depicted a faded, geometric pattern, a common enough sight. He crouched, his fingers tracing the cold, wet stone. "Structured how?" "Like walls," Ben said, pointing to a series of sharp, linear readings on his screen. "A complex of them, almost a maze. Roman construction is clean, you can see the lines of the villa's foundation clear as day. This is different. The signals are messy." Dr. Isabel Finch approached, her expression one of academic skepticism. She was a small woman with an immense presence, her eyes missing nothing. A pre-Roman structure, perhaps, a Celtic hill fort they built over. "The Celts in this region used earth and timber, Isabel," Kenji countered without turning. "Not deep, subterranean stonework. Whatever this is, it doesn't fit the historical profile." He tapped the mosaic floor. "We go through it, here. Mark a 2-meter square. I want to see what's underneath." Isabel's lips thinned. "Kenji, we can't simply punch through a preserved mosaic. Standard excavation protocol demands we clear the entire stratum before proceeding deeper. We risk destroying valuable context." "We risk running out of funding in 6 weeks, Kenji retorted, his voice low and sharp. He finally stood and faced her. "The university consortium is breathing down my neck. They want a significant find, something to justify the expense. A hidden subterranean complex qualifies as significant. A standard villa floor does not. We will document, photograph, and then remove a section for preservation. Carefully." His tone brokered no argument. Isabel gave a curt nod, her disapproval radiating from her. The specter of Kenji's last project, the disastrous dig at Amarna where he was accused of misinterpreting, of inventing context to fit a spectacular theory, hung between them. He was a man digging for his career as much as for Roman history. Everyone on the team understood it. Later that afternoon, as the team carefully prepared to cut into the mosaic, a new figure appeared at the temporary chain-link fence that marked the site's perimeter. Maeve O'Connell, their local liaison, arrived with a flask of tea and a box of biscuits. She was a woman who seemed rooted to the landscape, her movements easy and her eyes the color of the slate hills. "How is the great Roman invasion progressing?" she asked, her voice carrying a light musical accent. "We're staging our own invasion of their basement," Kenji said, accepting a cup of tea. "Apparently they built one the size of a tube station." Maeve's smile tightened. She peered into the pit, her gaze lingering on the spot Kenji had marked. "The old stories say this hill was a place you did not want to dig, a place where the earth held its secrets jealously." "Maeve, every hill in Wales has a story like that," Isabel commented, joining them. "It's how the old cultures marked sacred ground." "Exactly," Maeve said, her eyes meeting Isabel's. "It was sacred. The Ordovices Celts who lived here, they didn't bury their dead. They didn't build with stone. They worshipped the water, the trees, the soil itself. For them to have a sacred ground meant it was a place of immense power, a dangerous power. A power the Romans were happy to pave over," Kenji added, dismissing the folklore with a wave of his hand. "They were pragmatists." "They were conquerors," Maeve corrected softly. "They didn't pave it over. They drove a nail through it to hold it down." She pointed with her chin towards a small, weathered cottage on the opposite ridge, a plume of wood smoke rising from its chimney. "You should ask Owen Griffith about this place. His family has farmed that land for 500 years. They say his blood was here long before the Romans came." Kenji followed her gaze. He had seen the old farmer watching them from a distance, a silent, unmoving figure accompanied by a scruffy sheepdog. "And what will Mr. Griffith tell me? That we are angering the spirits of the earth." "He will tell you to leave," Maeve said simply. The conversation was interrupted by a shout from Ben. "Kenji, you need to see this." Kenji handed his cup to Maeve and hurried to the technical tent. On Ben's high-resolution monitor was a cleaned-up image from the GPR. The messy signals were resolving into a clearer picture. It was a complex of rooms, yes, but they were small, cellular. And a long, central corridor connected them to a much larger chamber, this one almost circular. It looked less like a cellar and more like a prison, or a kennel. "What is that?" Kenji breathed, leaning closer. "I don't know," Ben admitted. "But there's something else. I am picking up faint magnetic interference from the center of that big chamber. It is not modern. It's not a power line or a pipe. It is a constant, low-level field. Very strange." As dusk began to settle, painting the valley in shades of purple and deep gray, the team packed up their tools. The generator rumbled to life, powering a string of harsh security lights around the pit. Dunk Pears, the camp manager, a man built of solid, blocky muscle and quiet competence, made his rounds, checking the fence and the locks on the equipment shed. Kenji remained by the pit, staring at the marked square on the mosaic floor. The promise of what lay beneath was a physical weight in his chest, a career-defining discovery. He ignored the unease that pricked at the edges of his mind, the residue of Maeve's stories and Ben's strange readings. He was a scientist. He dealt in evidence, in stone and soil, not shadows and superstition. A sharp bark cut through the evening quiet. Kenji turned. On the other side of the fence, not 20 yards away, stood Owen Griffith. The old farmer was a silhouette against the fading light, his sheepdog a tense shape at his side, its hackles raised. The man himself was as still as the ancient standing stones that dotted the Welsh landscape. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture to halt. His voice, when it came, was rough, like stones grinding together. It carried with it the weight of generations who had avoided this patch of land. "You dig in a wound," the old farmer called out, his Welsh accent thick. "You think the scar is old, but the flesh beneath, it never healed." The dog let out a low growl. Owen Griffith said nothing more. He turned and, without a second glance, melted back into the twilight, leaving Kenji alone with the hum of the generator and the deep, silent darkness of the earth beneath his feet. The promise of discovery now felt colder, sharper. It felt less like an opportunity and more like a warning. Chapter 2: The Hypogeum. The next 2 days were a blur of painstaking, nerve-wracking work. Under Isabel's exacting supervision, the section of mosaic was documented with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. Every tile was photographed, its position triangulated, its coloration noted. A specialized team, brought in at great expense, then began the delicate process of lifting the 2-meter square. They worked beneath a large tarpaulin, the air thick with the smell of wet cement and chemical bonding agents. Kenji paced like a caged animal, his patience worn to a thread. The delay felt like a physical torment. On the third morning, the slab of mosaic and Roman concrete, a ton of history, was lifted clear by a portable crane. It swung away, revealing not soil but a perfectly flat, dark stone. It was basalt, a volcanic rock not native to this part of Wales. It was smooth, featureless, save for a single, deeply engraved symbol at its center. A coiled serpent biting its own tail, but with a Roman eagle's head. "I have never seen that iconography before," Isabel murmured, peering into the opening. "It's a syncretic symbol, and our robber rose, a symbol of eternity combined with the eagle of the Legion. It is a bastardization, a perversion." The basalt slab was not a floor. It was a capstone. Dunk and his team brought in heavy pry bars. The stone was sealed with a precision that was remarkable. It took them an hour to find a seam. When the bar finally bit and Dunk put his considerable weight into it, the sound was not of cracking stone, but of a deep, resonant thump, as if a great pressure seal had been broken. An odor poured from the opening. It was not the simple must of trapped air. It was a complex, foul perfume, cold, metallic, like old blood, mixed with the sharp tang of ammonia and a deeper, musky scent of something feral and long-caged. The workers recoiled, covering their mouths and noses. "What in God's name is that smell?" Ben gagged. "Air that has been trapped for 2,000 years, Kenji said, though his own stomach churned. He shone a powerful flashlight into the gap. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a flight of steep, narrow stone steps descending into blackness. Dunk was the first to volunteer. "I will check the structural integrity." He clipped a safety harness to a winch and descended, his heavy boots echoing in the confined space. A few minutes later, his voice came back, muffled but clear. "It's stable. The air is foul, but it opens into a larger space. It feels big." Kenji was next, followed by a reluctant Isabel, and then Ben, who carried a portable sensor suite. Maeve remained at the top, watching them go with an expression of profound disquiet. "Some doors should not be opened," she whispered to the wind. The chamber at the bottom of the stairs was square, its walls constructed from the same unfamiliar black basalt. The air was frigid, a deep cellar cold that had nothing to do with the mild day above. In the center of the room was a stone table, more of an altar, carved with deep channels that all led to a drain in the floor. Along the walls were niches, and in those niches were iron manacles, rusted but intact. What was most disturbing were the mosaics on the floor. Unlike the geometric patterns above, these were figurative and they were monstrous. They depicted scenes of grotesque surgery, robed figures, their faces obscured by shadows, operating on men who were bound to tables. The men in the mosaics were not just being operated on, they were being combined. A man's torso was being sutured to the hindquarters of a great boar. Another's arms were being reshaped, elongated, with leathery wings stitched to his back. This wasn't a villa, Isabel breathed, her voice trembling slightly as she aimed her light at the images. This was a laboratory, a vivisectorium. "It's a temple," Kenji countered, though his own conviction wavered. He pointed his light down a long corridor leading out of the main chamber. "This is a Mithraic temple. They practiced animal sacrifice, initiation rites." "They did not practice this," Isabel insisted, her finger tracing the outline of a figure with a man's body and the head of a badger. "This is something else, something forbidden even by their standards." Ben's sensor unit began to beep erratically. "The magnetic field is stronger down here, way stronger. It's not coming from any one point. The whole place is saturated with it." They proceeded down the corridor, their lights cutting cones through the oppressive darkness. The musky, animal smell grew stronger. The corridor was lined with small, cell-like rooms, their doors long since rotted away. Inside each were more restraints bolted to the walls and floor. Scorch marks, as if from ancient torches, stained the stone, and deep scratches marred the basalt, far too deep to have been made by human hands. The corridor ended at a heavy stone door banded with bronze. It was closed. A complex series of bolts and bars, now frozen with corrosion, held it shut. More symbols were carved into this door, this time in a crude, frantic hand. They were a mix of Latin and a script Isabel did not recognize. "That's Ogham," she said, her voice a hushed whisper of disbelief. "A Celtic script, but the words, they are Latin." She moved closer, running her fingers over the deep grooves. "Hic sunt monstra, here be monsters, ni aperias. Do not open, Deus, machina, sanguis, God, machine, blood." "It's a warning," Ben stated unnecessarily, his voice high and thin. Kenji's mind raced. This was it, the find of a lifetime. A secret, syncretic Roman cult performing forbidden experiments, a truth hidden beneath a veneer of domesticity. This would rewrite the history of the Roman occupation in Britain. It would vindicate him completely. The professional thrill momentarily eclipsed the creeping dread. "We need to get this open," he declared. "Kenji, no," Isabel pleaded. "The people who built this place, who created those horrors on the floor, they sealed this door for a reason. This entire complex was designed to keep something in." It was designed 2,000 years ago, Isabel. Whatever was in there is long dead, Kenji argued, his voice echoing in the corridor. He was already examining the mechanism of the lock. This is the primary chamber. Ben's magnetic readings are coming from behind this door. This is the heart of the discovery. As he spoke, a sound reached them from the other side of the stone door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape. It was the sound of something sharp, something hard, dragging against stone. They all froze, their flashlight beams converging on the door. The air grew thick, the silence absolute except for that one impossible noise. It wasn't the sound of a mechanism settling. It wasn't the sound of shifting earth. It was methodical. It sounded like a claw. Then came another sound from a different part of the door lower down. A frantic, scratching sound, like a trapped animal desperate to dig its way out. Ben backed away slowly, his sensor unit forgotten in his hand. That's not possible. The scratching intensified, coming from multiple points now. A dry, rasping sound, accompanied by a low, guttural chittering. It was the noise of a nest being disturbed. Kenji, Isabel whispered, her face pale as bone in the harsh light. We need to leave, now. Kenji didn't move. He was transfixed, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible sound with the laws of reality. He took a step closer to the door, straining to listen. The scratching stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, filled with a terrible, listening tension. And then from the other side of the stone came a new noise, a wet, tearing sound followed by a soft, heavy thump, and another, and another. It sounded as if something was being pushed through a narrow opening. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep from beneath the great stone door. It pooled on the floor, black and thick in their flashlight beams. The smell intensified tenfold, a nauseating wave of ammonia and rot. From the darkness of the corridor behind them, back the way they had come, a single, sharp pebble skittered across the floor. Dunk, who had been silent until now, spun around, his powerful beam cutting through the darkness. The entrance to the corridor was empty. What was that? Maybe a rat, Kenji offered, his voice strained. I have been in old places my entire life, Dunk said, his voice a low growl. That was not a rat. The chittering started again, but this time it was not from behind the door. It was closer. It was coming from the darkness of the corridor, from the small, empty cells they had just passed. Chapter 3: The Unearthing. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, descended upon the group. Every horror movie trope, every ghost story told around a campfire, suddenly felt like a documentary. The instinct to run warred with the paralysis of disbelief. Back to the stairs, Dunk commanded, his voice slicing through the tension. Slowly, stay in the light. He began to walk backwards, his flashlight beam held steady on the yawning blackness of the corridor. Kenji and Isabel turned, flanking Ben, who seemed to be in a state of shock, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness. They moved as a single, terrified organism, their footsteps loud in the confined space. The scratching sounds from the cells grew louder, more frantic. It sounded like dozens of animals, all digging at once. They reached the main chamber with the vivisection table. The air here seemed marginally cleaner, the route to the surface terrifyingly close. "Ben, you go first," Dunk ordered. "Isabel, then Kenji. I am right behind you." Ben scrambled for the steep stone steps, his hands finding purchase on the cold basalt. He was halfway up when the main generator on the surface sputtered. The powerful floodlights illuminating the entrance above them flickered, died, then flickered again before plunging the hypogeum into near-total darkness, save for their battery-powered beams. A woman's voice screamed from above ground. It was Maeve. "What is happening up there?" Isabel cried out, her voice echoing with panic. "Ben, keep going," Dunk yelled. From the corridor, the chittering erupted into a cacophony of shrieks. A shape darted from one of the cell doorways, low to the ground, fast, a blur of motion at the edge of Dunk's light. It was gone before anyone could register what it was. "They're out," Dunk stated, a grim finality in his voice. "They are coming." At the top of the stairs, Ben reached the surface and hauled himself into the excavation pit. "The generator cable's been cut," he shouted down, his voice panicked. "It's chewed through. Maeve, where are you?" There was no answer. Below ground, another creature darted across the far side of the chamber. This time Kenji saw it more clearly. It was pale, its skin a sickly white. It moved on all fours, but its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. It had a vaguely humanoid torso, but its head was low and elongated like a badger's, with a mouth full of needle-like teeth. Its eyes were small black beads that reflected the light with a dead, soulless sheen. A scrabbler, the thing from Isabel's mosaic. It let out a high-pitched shriek and scrambled back into the darkness. A chorus of shrieks answered it from the corridor. "Go," Dunk roared, shoving Kenji towards the stairs. Kenji needed no further encouragement. He and Isabel scrambled up the steps, their hands slipping on the damp stone. Dunk followed, his flashlight beam still pointed at the corridor, walking backwards to cover their retreat. The shrieks grew to a fever pitch. A wave of the creatures poured from the corridor into the main chamber. There were dozens of them. They swarmed over the stone table, their long claws scraping against the basalt, their chittering filling the air. They were a tide of pale flesh and snapping teeth, moving with a horrifying, insect-like purpose. Kenji and Isabel burst onto the surface, gasping in the humid evening air. The excavation pit was lit only by the frantic, sweeping beams of their headlamps. The main security lights were dead. The large portable generator was silent, a thick cable lying next to it, its end a mess of frayed copper and gnawed plastic. "Maeve," Kenji shouted into the gloom. "Over here." Her voice came from near the tool shed. Kenji and Isabel ran towards the sound, their feet slipping in the mud. They found her pressed against the corrugated metal wall, her face a mask of terror. One of the student volunteers lay on the ground near her, his leg bent at a sickening angle, a dark stain spreading across his jeans. "It came out of the dark," Maeve stammered, pointing a trembling finger not at the pit but at the surrounding woods. "It was so fast, big, not like the ones you saw. It grabbed him, then it just dropped him. It was watching the pit." Before Kenji could process this, a new horror unfolded. Ben, who had been trying to get a signal on his satellite phone, let out a terrified yell. A sinkhole had opened beneath him, the ground simply giving way. He was waist-deep in the raw earth, his arms flailing. Dunk, emerging from the pit, saw what was happening. "It's the tunnels. They are coming up from below." He ran towards Ben, but it was too late. Two pale, long-fingered hands erupted from the soil and grabbed Ben's ankles. The creatures were burrowing, turning the very ground they stood on into a trap. Ben was dragged down with a choked scream, his terrified face the last thing they saw before the earth swallowed him whole. The sinkhole collapsed in on itself, leaving only a mound of disturbed soil. The archaeological site had become a killing field. The scrabblers began to pour from the main opening of the hypogeum, their pale bodies swarming up the steps and into the pit. They moved with a terrifying speed, their shrieks piercing the night. "The cabin," Dunk bellowed, changing direction. "Get to the main cabin now." The main cabin was a large, prefabricated structure that served as their office, lab, and common room. It was their only defensible position. Dunk grabbed the injured student, lifting him in a fireman's carry with a grunt of effort. Kenji took Maeve's arm, pulling her along as Isabel ran beside them. They sprinted across the muddy site, the shrieking of the scrabblers echoing behind them. The creatures were fanning out, their forms ghostly and unreal in the darkness. Kenji risked a look over his shoulder. The scrabblers were not just fast, they were relentless. They scrambled over equipment under vehicles, a flowing river of white-fleshed nightmares. They reached the cabin and tumbled inside, the injured student groaning in pain. Dunk slammed the reinforced door and threw the heavy deadbolt. The sound was deafeningly final. For a moment there was silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. Then came the first impact. A scrabbler threw itself against the door, its claws scraping frantically at the metal. Another hit a window, a reinforced pane of polycarbonate that shuddered but held. Soon, the entire cabin was under assault. The walls shook with the force of their impacts. Shrieks and chittering came from all sides, the sound of claws on metal, on wood, on the very foundations of the building. Dunk laid the student down gently. "Find the first aid kit," he ordered Maeve. He went to a large footlocker in the corner and kicked it open. Inside were his personal security items, a high-powered flare gun, several canisters of bear spray, and a heavy, long-handled fire axe. He hefted the axe, its weight seeming to settle him. Kenji stood by a window, peering through a gap in the blinds. The site was crawling with the creatures. They were testing every inch of the cabin, searching for a way in. They moved with a disturbing coordination, not like dumb animals, but like a pack of trained hunters. "We are trapped," Isabel stated, her voice flat with shock. She had backed into a corner, her eyes darting around the room as if the creatures were already inside. "They dug for 2,000 years, Kenji said, a horrifying realization dawning on him. That sound. They weren't trying to get out. They were digging their way to us." The scratching at the door stopped. The impacts on the walls ceased. An eerie silence fell over the site once more. "What are they doing?" Maeve asked, her voice a fearful whisper. Dunk moved to the door, listening intently. "They are learning." From the far side of the valley, a new sound began. It was not a shriek. It was a deep, guttural roar, a sound of command. It was a sound of intelligent, malevolent rage. It was the sound of the big one Maeve had seen. As if in answer to the roar, the ground beneath the cabin began to vibrate. A low, rhythmic thudding started, coming from directly underneath the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. The scrabblers weren't trying to break down the walls anymore. They were coming up from below. Chapter 4: Corvus's Cohort. The rhythmic thudding from beneath the floorboards was a physical presence, a monstrous heartbeat that resonated in their bones. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights. Every creak of the cabin structure sounded like a prelude to collapse. The injured student, a young man named Alex, whimpered in a delirium of pain and fear. Maeve was tending to his leg, her hands surprisingly steady as she applied a makeshift splint. "They're digging," Dunk said, his knuckles white where he gripped the fire axe. "They will be through the floor soon." He scanned the room, his eyes cataloging every object. "We need to barricade the floor. Get the tables, the heavy equipment, crates, anything with weight." Action was an antidote to paralysis. Kenji and Isabel, jolted from their shock, began to help Dunk heave a heavy steel sample table onto its side. They dragged it over the spot where the thumping was most pronounced. They piled crates of soil samples, boxes of reference books, and pieces of electronic equipment on top, creating a desperate makeshift fortress inside their fortress. The thumping shifted to a different part of the room. The creatures were testing the entire foundation. "It won't be enough," Isabel said, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "This is a temporary measure. They are relentless." She looked at Kenji, her academic composure shattered, replaced by a raw, accusing anger. "You had to open the door. You had to see what was inside. Are you happy, Kenji? Is this the significant find you were hopping for?" The word struck Kenji like a physical blow. Guilt, cold and sharp, cut through his adrenaline. Ben's face, swallowed by the earth, flashed in his mind. I did not know." "No," Isabel shot back, her voice dripping with scorn. "You did not want to know. Maeve warned you. The warnings were carved on the door. You saw the mosaics. You chose to see a career opportunity, not a tomb." "Enough," Dunk cut in, his voice a low growl. "Blame will not keep them out. We need a plan." He looked at Isabel. "Those carvings, the writings you found, what did they say? What are these things?" Isabel took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to focus. She retrieved her satchel, her hands shaking as she pulled out the high-resolution photographs she had taken of the lead tablets they had found in the first chamber. She spread them on the one remaining clear table, her headlamp illuminating the dense, spidery script. "It is a journal," she began, her voice gaining strength as she slipped into the familiar role of the translator, the academic. "The private log of the commander, Legatus Vitalius Corvus. He was in command of a cohort of the XX Legion, the Valeria Victrix, but his cohort was different. They were disgraced soldiers, criminals, and political exiles, a dumping ground for the Legion's undesirables. He calls them his cohort of the damned." She traced the Latin text with her finger. Corvus was a follower of a splinter cult, not Mithras, something darker. He believed the Roman gods were weak, decadent. He worshipped strength, predation, the perfect killing instinct of the beast. He saw the human soldier as flawed, hampered by fear, by morality, by the weakness of the flesh. The thumping beneath them stopped. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. "They have stopped," Maeve whispered. "No," Dunk said, his eyes scanning the windows. "They are listening." Isabel swallowed hard and continued, her voice now a hushed, conspiratorial whisper in the silent cabin. Corvus came to this valley because his scouts reported that the local Celtic tribes considered it a place of great power, a thin place, as Maeve called it. He did not see a god in the earth. He saw a power source, an energy he could use for his work. His work was creating monsters, Kenji stated, looking at the barricade. He called it improving the vessel, Isabel corrected. He brought a physician, a Greek named Hypatios, a man who had been exiled from Alexandria for practicing vivisection on condemned prisoners. Together, they believed they could merge the spirit of the predator with the body of a man. They captured wild animals, boars, badgers, wolves, bats, and they used their own soldiers as the human subjects. A collective gasp went through the room. Alex, the injured student, let out a low moan. "He writes about it with such pride," Isabel continued, her voice thick with disgust. "He describes the process, how they used the site's energy to keep the subjects alive during the surgery, how they used Celtic blood rituals learned from a captive druid to bind the animal spirit to the human soul. Most died, horribly, but some survived the process. They became his perfect soldiers, stronger, faster, without fear or pity. His cohort of the damned became a cohort of the truly damned." The roar from the valley echoed again, closer this time. It was answered by the chittering of the scrabblers, a sound that now seemed less like animalistic rage and more like a military response. "The ones that burrow," Dunk said, pointing at the floor. "The badger men." "The scrabblers," Isabel confirmed, her eyes scanning the text. "They were his sappers, his engineers of terror, designed to collapse fortifications from below." He writes of others, the noctule, the bat hybrid for aerial reconnaissance, and his greatest success, his centurion, a fusion of his strongest soldier and a great boar. He called it the gourmand. As she spoke the name, a massive impact struck the cabin's main door. It was not the frantic scratching of a scrabbler. It was a single, focused blow of immense power. The heavy steel door buckled inward, its hinges groaning in protest. "That's him," Maeve breathed, her eyes wide with terror. Dunk moved to the door, pressing his ear against the cold metal. "He's testing it, looking for a weak point." Another thunderous blow struck the door, and this time one of the hinges ripped free from the frame with a shriek of tortured metal. The door hung askew. "The flares!" Kenji shouted, remembering the contents of Dunk's security locker. "They are creatures of darkness. Maybe the light will drive them off." Dunk nodded, grabbing the flare gun. "Good thinking." He moved to the window furthest from the door, smashed the polycarbonate with the butt of his axe, and aimed the pistol into the night. He fired. The flare shot into the sky with a deafening whoosh, exploding in a brilliant, searing ball of crimson light. For a few seconds, the entire site was bathed in an unnatural, bloody daylight. And they saw it. Standing before the cabin door was a creature that defied sanity. It was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with the bipedal stance of a man but the physique of a nightmare. Its body was a mass of corded muscle and thick, bristly hide. Its head was that of a monstrous wild boar, with a long, tough snout and wicked, yellowed tusks that curved upwards. Embedded in its flesh were twisted pieces of Roman armor, the metal fused with the skin and bone. Its eyes were small, black, and burned with a terrifying, ancient intelligence, the gourmand. Surrounding it, arrayed in a loose, disciplined semicircle, were dozens of scrabblers. They were not a mindless horde. They were an army, and the gourmand was their commander. The flare began to descend, its light sputtering. The creatures did not shrink from it. They seemed angered by it. The gourmand let out another roar, a direct challenge to the light, and slammed its shoulder into the damaged door again. The remaining hinge tore loose. The door crashed inward, falling into the cabin with a deafening clang. Standing in the ruined doorway, silhouetted against the dying flare, was the monster from Rome's darkest dream. It lowered its massive head, snorted, and took a step inside. Chapter 5: The Alpha's Gambit. The gourmand filled the doorway, a hulking monument to unnatural creation. The stench that rolled off it was overpowering, a rank mix of pigsty, old blood, and damp earth. It took another heavy step into the cabin, its cloven hooves clicking on the floorboards. Its small, intelligent eyes scanned the room, assessing them. It was not a mindless beast charging in. It was a general surveying a battlefield. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen. Then Dunk reacted. "Get back," he yelled, shoving Kenji and Isabel towards the rear of the cabin. He hefted the fire axe, placing himself between the monster and the others. The gourmand eyed the axe, then met Dunk's gaze. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a sound of amusement, of contempt. It did not attack Dunk. Instead, it let out a short, sharp bark. From the darkness outside, 2 scrabblers shot through the open doorway. They ignored Dunk completely, their movements a blur of pale limbs and chittering jaws as they scrambled towards the opposite side of the room, towards Alex, the injured student, and Maeve. It was a feint, a strategic diversion. "Maeve!" Kenji screamed. Maeve shoved the first aid kit at the oncoming creature, a useless gesture. But Dunk was already moving. He abandoned his standoff with the gourmand and charged across the room, his axe swinging in a wide arc. The heavy blade connected with the first scrabbler, cleaving through its skull with a wet crunch. It collapsed in a heap without a sound. The second scrabbler leaped, not at Maeve but at the wall beside her. Its long claws found purchase on the cheap wood paneling, and it began to climb, its head twisting at an impossible angle to keep its eyes on them. It was trying to flank them, to get behind their defenses. While Dunk was occupied, the gourmand made its move. It charged, not at Dunk but straight at the barricade of tables and crates they had built over the floor. It hit the pile with the force of a battering ram. Metal screamed, wood splintered, and the entire barricade was thrown across the room. The gourmand stood over the now exposed floorboards, stomped once with a heavy hoof, and the wood shattered, revealing the dark, raw earth beneath. It had created its own entrance for its burrowing troops. "It's smarter than us," Isabel whispered in horror, huddled with Kenji behind a filing cabinet. It's using tactics. Dunk, having dispatched the second scrabbler with another brutal swing of his axe, turned to face the gourmand. The creature ignored him. It grunted another command into the hole it had made, and pale, clawed hands began to emerge from the soil. Outside, the last of the flare died, plunging the sight into darkness again, save for their wavering flashlights. The main body of scrabblers, no longer held at bay, began to pour through the open doorway. They were being overwhelmed, systematically dismantled. "The window," Dunk shouted, pointing with his axe. "Get out through the back window." Kenji grabbed Isabel's arm. "He's right, we have to go." Maeve was already helping Alex, trying to get him to his feet. The student cried out in pain as he put weight on his shattered leg. They were not going to be fast. The gourmand turned its attention back to Dunk. It lowered its head, pawed at the floor like a bull about to charge, and let out a deafening roar. This was it. The commander was joining the fight. Dunk met the charge. He swung the axe not at the creature's head but at its legs, a soldier's move to disable rather than kill. The gourmand was impossibly fast for its size. It sidestepped the blow, and the axe head buried itself in the floorboards. As Dunk struggled to wrench it free, the gourmand swiped with a thick, powerful arm. The blow caught Dunk in the chest. It didn't have claws, but the sheer kinetic force was devastating. There was a sickening crack of breaking bone. Dunk was lifted from his feet and thrown across the room, crashing into the far wall with a final, choked gasp. He slid to the floor, motionless, the fire axe still stuck in the floor, a fallen warrior's monument. Kenji stared in horror. Their protector, their one-man army, was gone. The scrabblers swarmed into the room, a chittering tide of death. Kenji grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and blasted a wave of CO2 foam into the face of the nearest creature, driving it back with a high-pitched squeal. "Go," he screamed at Maeve and Isabel. "Get him out of here." Isabel smashed the back window with a stool. Cold night air flooded the room. She climbed through, then turned to help Maeve guide Alex through the opening. The student's leg scraped against the broken frame, and he cried out, but they managed to pull him clear. Kenji backed towards the window, spraying the extinguisher, keeping the scrabblers at bay. The gourmand watched him, its head cocked. It made no move to charge. It seemed content to let its minions do the work. It had already eliminated the greatest threat. He was almost at the window when a scrabbler burst from the hole in the floor right at his feet. He had no time to react. It latched onto his leg, its needle-like teeth sinking deep into his calf. Kenji yelled in pain, kicking frantically. He stumbled backwards, falling through the window frame and landing hard on the muddy ground outside. The scrabbler held on, its jaw locked with incredible strength. He could see Maeve and Isabel dragging Alex towards the woods, towards the darkness that promised concealment. He was on his own. He rolled over, ignoring the searing pain in his leg, and smashed the heavy extinguisher down on the scrabbler's head again and again. The creature's skull finally gave way with a wet crack. It went limp, but its jaws remained clamped to his leg. Kenji pushed himself up. He could hear the gourmand's guttural grunts from inside the cabin. It was not pursuing. Not yet. He had to move. He began to drag himself, his injured leg leaving a trail in the mud towards the fence, towards the dark outline of Owen Griffith's farm on the distant ridge. As he crawled, his hand brushed against something in the mud. He fumbled for his flashlight, which had fallen nearby. He aimed the beam at the object. It was a small lead tablet, one of the ones from the Hypogeum. Isabel must have dropped it. The Latin script was caked with mud, but he could make out two words, etched with a frantic, desperate hand. They were the last words of Legatus Vitellius Corvus, a final addendum to his profane journal. Victoriam F. Fame. Victory through hunger. A new, chilling understanding washed over Kenji. The creatures hadn't eaten Ben. They hadn't eaten Dunk. They weren't hunting for food. They were soldiers following a 2,000-year-old order. Secure the site, eliminate all hostiles. He looked back at the ruined cabin. The gorman stood in the doorway, a dark, massive silhouette. It was watching him. It was letting him go, letting him lead it to the other survivors. The hunt was not over. It had just entered a new, more terrifying phase. Chapter 6. The Shepherd's Mercy. Pain was the only thing that felt real. A hot, serrated agony radiated from Kenji's calf, each desperate movement sending fresh waves of fire up his leg. The mud was a greedy, sucking thing, trying to pull him back towards the carnage at the cabin. Behind him, the sounds of destruction had faded, replaced by an even more terrifying silence. He knew it was the silence of a predator that had secured its den and was now watching, waiting, letting its wounded prey exhaust itself. He dragged his body forward, his arms screaming with effort. The chain-link fence that marked the site's perimeter seemed a mile away. The dead weight of the scrabbler was still attached to his leg, a grotesque anchor of bone and sinew. He could feel its teeth grinding against his tibia with every pull. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the single, faint light on the ridge. The light from Owen Griffith's farmhouse. A beacon in a world that had suddenly shrunk to mud, pain, and fear. The journey to the fence took an eternity. When he finally reached it, his fingers hooking into the cold, wet wire, he almost wept with a mixture of relief and despair. It was another obstacle. He looked back. No figures moved in the darkness. The cabin was a dead, silent box, but he felt the gorman's presence, a heavy weight on the air, an intelligent gaze that was tracking his pathetic progress. It was a game to the creature. He was the fox, and it had released the hounds. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled himself up the fence. The wire cut into his hands. His injured leg was a dead weight. When he tried to swing it over the top, the scrabbler's body snagged in the wire. He hung there, suspended and hideously vulnerable, a pathetic silhouette against the night sky. He kicked, he twisted, and the creature's jaws finally ripped free from his leg with a wet, tearing sound that made him scream, a thin, ragged noise that was swallowed by the wind. He tumbled over the fence, landing in a heap on the damp grass of the pasture. He lay there gasping, the world spinning. The pain in his leg was a blinding, white-hot nova. He was done. He had nothing left. He closed his eyes, the smell of the wet grass filling his senses. This was where it would end. A low growl startled him. He opened his eyes. Standing over him was Owen Griffith's sheepdog, its hackles raised, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. It was not threatening him, he realized. It was facing the fence, its body a tense line aimed at the darkness of the dig site. A moment later, the old farmer himself was there, a heavy wooden staff in one hand and an old, oil-burning lantern in the other. The lantern's warm, flickering light pushed back the oppressive gloom. Owen looked down at Kenji, his face a mask of grim resignation carved from old wood and hard years. There was no pity in his eyes, only a deep, weary anger. "You were told," Owen said, his voice quiet but carrying the force of a judgment. "This is your work. This is the wound you have opened." "Help me," Kenji rasped, the words catching in his throat. The farmer stared at him for a long moment, his gaze flicking between Kenji's mangled leg and the silent darkness of the valley below. The dog let out another low growl. Owen seemed to come to a decision. The beast watches, it plays with you. It will not cross the old boundary tonight, not while it has sport within. He nudged Kenji's shoulder with the end of his staff. "Get up." "I can't." "You will," Owen stated. It was not a suggestion. He offered no helping hand. He simply waited. Somehow Kenji found the strength. He used the fence to pull himself into a shambling, one-legged stance. The world tilted violently. Owen watched, his expression unchanging. He then turned and began to walk up the hill towards his farmhouse, the dog trotting at his heels. He did not look back. It was clear. If Kenji wanted to live, he had to follow. The walk to the farmhouse was a new kind of hell. Every step on his good leg sent a jarring shockwave through his body. He dragged his injured leg, leaving a dark trail in the grass. By the time he reached the stone cottage, his clothes were soaked with a mixture of sweat, mud, and blood. The farmhouse was ancient. The stones were covered in moss, the roof was slate, and a heavy oak door was bound with strips of black iron. A piece of rusted iron, a horseshoe, was nailed above the frame. Owen pushed the door open and gestured Kenji inside. The interior was Spartan. A single main room with a large, crackling fireplace that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, old wool, and something else, something sharp and herbal. There was a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, and a staircase leading to a loft. There were no modern conveniences visible, no television, no telephone. It was a home out of time. "Sit," Owen commanded, pointing to a chair by the fire. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a bottle of dark liquid, a rag, and a wicked-looking knife with a blade blackened by fire. "Drink." He uncorked the bottle and handed it to Kenji. Kenji took a long, desperate swallow. It was whiskey, raw and potent. It burned a trail down his throat and hit his stomach like a fist, but it dulled the edges of the pain. Owen knelt and, without any gentleness, ripped Kenji's trouser leg open to the knee. The bite was a ghastly mess. Deep, circular punctures were arranged in the shape of the creature's jaw, the flesh around them already turning a bruised, purplish black. The wound was weeping a thin, oily fluid. The farmer examined it, his face impassive. Its teeth carry the rot of the earth, the poison of the old blood. He looked up at Kenji. "This will hurt." He didn't wait for a reply. He poured the raw whiskey directly into the wound. Kenji screamed, his body arching in the chair, the pain so intense it was a white light behind his eyes. Before he could recover, Owen took the heated knife from the mantelpiece and pressed the flat of the glowing blade against the deepest punctures. The hiss of his flesh searing was sickening. The smell of it was worse. Kenji's world dissolved into a vortex of agony, and he mercifully passed out. He awoke sometime later. He was lying on a cot in the corner of the room, a rough wool blanket thrown over him. The fire was banked, casting a low orange glow. His leg was tightly bound in clean linen, and it throbbed with a deep, rhythmic ache, but the sharp, searing pain was gone. Owen Griffith sat at the table, sharpening the blade of his knife with a whetstone. The sound was a steady, rhythmic sheeing in the quiet room. The dog lay before the hearth, its head on its paws, but its eyes were open, fixed on the door. "You should have left it buried," Owen said, not looking up from his work. "My father and his father and all the fathers before him, we were the keepers of the peace. We did not guard the hill. We guarded the world from what was in the hill." "What are they?" Kenji asked, his voice a dry croak. "They are the XX cohort," Owen replied, the name sounding strange and alien in his Welsh accent. "The lost, the un-Roman. They were made in that pit, a blasphemy of iron and flesh and the old magic. They were bred for one purpose, to kill. When their maker, the black eagle Corvus, could no longer control them, he sealed them in. He thought time would starve them, that the earth would claim them. He was wrong. They did not need food. They only needed orders. They have been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Owen finally stopped his work. He looked at Kenji, his eyes dark pools of ancient knowledge. "For the trumpet call, for the seal to be broken, for a new commander to give them a war to fight. You, Dr. Tanaka, you are their trumpet." A frantic scratching sound came from the heavy oak door. The dog shot to its feet, a low, rumbling growl starting deep in its chest. Owen stood, the knife held ready. The scratching was not the frenzied attack of the scrabblers at the cabin. It was weaker, more desperate. It was followed by a human voice, a choked, terrified whisper. "Please, anyone, help us." It was Isabel. Owen moved to the door but did not open it. He put his eye to a small peephole drilled in the thick wood. He was silent for a long time. The dog continued its low, menacing growl. "There is a woman," Owen said, his voice flat, "and another helping a wounded boy. They are alone." He paused, for now. He looked over at Kenji, a silent question in his eyes. "Let them in," Kenji pleaded. "For God's sake, let them in." Owen Griffith stared at the door, then at Kenji's bandaged leg. He seemed to be weighing the fate of the world against the lives of 3 strangers. "Open the door," he said to the wood, his voice loud and clear, "and you invite the war into my home." He turned his gaze back to the peephole. "The winged one is in the sky. It has been watching you run. It has brought the others. They are at the tree line. They wait." Outside, Isabel's voice came again, fraught with a new wave of panic. "It's coming. Oh God, it's coming." A new sound joined her cries, a series of sharp, clicking noises and a high-pitched, piercing shriek that seemed to come from directly above. Chapter 7: The Whispering Woods. The forest was a cage of black trees and grasping thorns. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the terrifying stillness. Maeve led the way, her knowledge of the terrain the only thing that kept them moving in the right direction. Isabel and Alex followed, a clumsy, three-legged creature of pain and desperation. Alex was in a bad way, his face clammy and pale in the intermittent moonlight that filtered through the thick canopy. Every lurch and stumble sent a fresh jolt of agony through his broken leg, and he fought to stifle the moans that threatened to escape his lips. "We have to stop," Isabel gasped, her lungs burning. "Just for a minute, he can't take much more." Maeve paused, listening to the sounds of the night. The shrieking of the scrabblers had faded behind them, but the woods were not silent. There was a profound, unnatural quiet where the normal chorus of insects and night birds should have been. The forest was holding its breath. "We can't stop here," Maeve whispered, her voice tight. "We are too exposed. There is an old shepherd's bothy, a stone hut, a half-mile north of here. If we can make it there, we can rest." They pushed on. The woods grew denser, the path less clear. Ancient, moss-covered oaks loomed over them like silent giants. Isabel, the historian, felt a primal terror she had only ever read about. This was the wild, untamed Britain that the Romans had feared, a land of deep shadows and older, darker powers. Her academic understanding of the world had been a shield, and that shield was now shattered. She was just another terrified animal fleeing a predator she could not comprehend. It was Alex who heard it first. He stopped, his head cocked. "What's that sound?" he whispered. They all froze, straining their ears. It was a faint, rhythmic clicking like pebbles being tapped together. The sound was difficult to place. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. It grew steadily louder, closer. Maeve's face went rigid with a new kind of fear. She scanned the canopy above them. "Get down," she hissed, pulling them behind the gnarled roots of a massive fallen oak. "And do not make a sound, do not even breathe." They huddled in the darkness, their bodies pressed against the damp earth. The clicking grew louder still, accompanied now by a dry, leathery rustling. A shadow passed over the moon, and a creature descended from the sky. It landed without a sound on a thick branch directly above them. The noctule. It was a thing of utter nightmare. Its body was thin and disturbingly human-like, but its skin was pallid and hairless. Its arms were impossibly long, ending not in hands but in elongated fingers that formed the structure of huge, leathery wings. Its head was tilted down towards them, and it had no eyes. In their place were smooth patches of skin. Its face was dominated by a small, puckered mouth that opened and closed, emitting the sharp, echolocating clicks that had warned them of its approach. It was hunting, and it was hunting by sound. Alex had his hand clamped over his mouth, his whole body trembling. A low, involuntary whimper escaped him. The noctule's head snapped towards the sound. The clicking intensified, becoming a rapid, drilling staccato. It unfolded its wings, a vast, dark cloak against the sky, and launched itself from the branch. It did not fly away. It glided down, circling their hiding place, its sightless face aimed at the ground, narrowing its search. Maeve slowly, silently, reached for a loose rock the size of her fist. Isabel watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The creature was a biological impossibility, a perversion of nature created by Roman hubris. She understood now, with a terrifying clarity, that Corvus had not just created soldiers. He had created perfect hunters, each designed to exploit a different human weakness. The scrabblers exploited the ground beneath their feet. The gourmand exploited their faith in fortifications. And this noctule, exploited their very need to breathe, to cry out in fear. The creature landed on the forest floor not 10 feet away. It moved awkwardly on the ground, its wings folded, using the claws on its wingtips to help it crawl. It crept towards their hiding place, its head sweeping back and forth, the clicks becoming soft, inquisitive. It knew they were there. It was pinpointing their exact location. Maeve's arm moved in a slow, deliberate arc. She threw the rock as hard as she could, not at the creature, but deep into the woods to their left. The rock crashed through the undergrowth, a loud, startling noise in the silence. The noctule reacted instantly. It let out a piercing shriek of rage and scrambled towards the sound, crashing through the bushes with surprising speed. Now Maeve whispered, "Run!" They fled, half carrying, half dragging Alex between them. They ran blindly, recklessly, crashing through ferns and stumbling over roots. They could hear the noctule shrieking behind them, the sound of its fury as it realized it had been tricked. Then its shriek changed. It took on a new tone, a new purpose. It was no longer a hunting sound. It was a signal. And from the valley below, a chorus of chittering shrieks answered. The noctule was calling the scrabblers to its position. It was a spotter for the ground troops. "The bothy," Maeve gasped, pointing. Through the trees they could see a low, dark shape. A small, windowless hut made of piled stones, its roof long since collapsed and replaced with turf. It was their only hope. They reached it just as the first of the scrabblers burst through the undergrowth behind them. Maeve and Isabel shoved Alex through the narrow doorway and scrambled in after him, pulling a heavy, half-rotted wooden door into place. There was no way to lock it. Isabel used her own body to brace it shut. The bothy was tiny, a single room that smelled of sheep, damp earth, and decay. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the turf roof, revealing piles of old animal droppings and the faint outline of a primitive fireplace. It was a tomb, a temporary tomb. The scrabblers threw themselves against the door, their claws splintering the ancient wood. Isabel grunted with the effort of holding it, her shoulder screaming in protest. Alex lay on the floor, his face ashen, his breath coming in shallow pants. "We are trapped," he whispered. "We are alive," Maeve countered, though her voice lacked conviction. She was rummaging through a pile of debris in the corner, her hand closed on something. "There is another way. The shepherds, they would build escape tunnels, in case of wolves or a bad storm." Her fingers found a large, flat stone embedded in the floor at the rear of the hut. She began to pry at it with a piece of slate. Outside, the shrieks and scratching suddenly stopped. Isabel, pressed against the door, held her breath. A moment later, a heavy, wet thump sounded from the roof. And another. The noctule had landed. A long, three-fingered claw, like a grotesque parody of a hand, slid through a gap in the turf roof, twitching, feeling the air inside the hut. Then from the front came the sound of splintering wood. The scrabblers were no longer just scratching. They were systematically tearing the door apart. The flat stone in the floor finally moved, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A tunnel. It was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. "Go," Maeve urged, pointing into the blackness. "It should come out in the gully on the other side of this hillock." "We can't leave you," Isabel protested. One of us has to hold the door, Maeve said, her face grim in the moonlight. I am the one who knows the way. I will follow. Now go, get him out of here. Isabel hesitated for only a second. She looked at Alex, at the splintering door, at the claw twitching from the ceiling. She made the impossible choice. Okay. She helped Alex into the tunnel, his injured leg making the process agonizingly slow. The smell of damp, claustrophobic earth filled her nostrils. As she prepared to follow him, she looked back at Maeve. The young woman stood with her back to them, her small frame braced against the door, a piece of heavy slate clutched in her hand like a weapon. The scrabblers were breaking through. Pale, clawed hands were tearing at the edges of the doorway. Maeve, Isabel cried. Maeve did not turn. The farm, she shouted, her voice strained with effort. Get to Griffith's farm, it is the only place. Isabel scrambled into the tunnel, pushing Alex from behind. She could hear the door finally give way, the triumphant shrieks of the scrabblers, a single, defiant cry from Maeve, and then a terrible, wet, tearing sound that was abruptly cut short. Isabel squeezed her eyes shut, a sob catching in her throat. She kept crawling, pushing the whimpering student forward into the suffocating darkness of the earth. She was no longer a historian. She was a survivor, and she was a coward. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than the tons of soil above her head. Chapter 8: A Cohort of the Damned. The silence from the peephole stretched into an eternity. Owen Griffith remained motionless, a stone sentinel observing the desperate scene unfolding outside his home. Kenji, helpless on the cot, could hear Isabel's panicked cries, the terrifying clicks of the noctule, and the distant, approaching chitter of the scrabblers. They used her, Owen said, his voice a low, analytical growl devoid of emotion. The winged one. It drove them here to my door. He pulled back from the peephole. The gourmand is clever. It knows this is a hard place. It uses the living as bait to draw out the defenders. You have to do something, Kenji insisted, trying to push himself up. The pain in his leg was a vicious, grinding thing. I am, Owen replied, turning from the door. He walked to the massive stone hearth and began to pry a loose stone from the wall beside it. I am choosing the battlefield, not him. He pulled the stone free, revealing a dark, hidden compartment. From within, he removed a long, heavy bundle wrapped in oiled leather. He placed it on the table and unrolled it. Inside were not guns. There was a crossbow, heavy and modern, with a steel prod and a sleek composite stock. Beside it lay a quiver of thick, menacing bolts. But these were not normal crossbow bolts. Their heads were not simple points, but complex, screw-like tips forged from a dull, silvery metal. There was also a short, heavy-bladed spear, its head made of the same strange metal, and a series of small, clay pots sealed with wax. What is that? Kenji asked, staring at the strange arsenal. Iron, Owen said, picking up one of the bolts. Cold iron, forged from a meteorite that fell in this valley when my grandfather's grandfather was a boy. They do not like it. It disrupts their cohesion. It reminds their flesh that it is not natural. He began to methodically load the crossbow. They are a fusion of man, beast, and the energy of this place. The iron shorts the circuit. A blood-curdling scream from outside ripped through the night. It was followed by a chorus of triumphant shrieks. Kenji felt his stomach clench. Maeve. They have made their kill, Owen stated, his face grim. He moved back to the door, peering through the peephole again. The others, a woman and the boy, they are running, they are coming this way. He glanced at Kenji. Your friends are leading the cohort to my door. Then help them, Kenji shouted, his voice cracking. Owen ignored him. He picked up one of the clay pots and unsealed it. The smell that filled the room was sharp and acrid, a mix of pine resin, sulfur, and something else Kenji couldn't identify. Owen went to the small, shuttered window at the side of the cottage, the one that faced the woods from which Isabel and Alex would emerge. He cracked the heavy wooden shutter just enough to see out. They are at the tree line, he murmured. The scrabblers are close behind, 10, no 12 of them. He lit a long spill from the fire, his movements calm and practiced. The gourmand has held back. It wants to see how I respond. It is testing my defenses. He touched the spill to a fuse on the clay pot. It sputtered to life. This is not my home, Owen said, almost to himself. It is a fortress, and the first rule of a siege is to control the killing ground. With a powerful underhand throw, he lobbed the pot out the window. It sailed through the air in a graceful arc and shattered on the ground about 30 yards from the cottage, right in the path of the fleeing survivors. For a second, nothing happened. Then the mixture ignited. It did not explode. It erupted in a shower of brilliant, white-hot sparks, spreading a thick, sticky, burning substance in a wide circle. The fire burned with an unnatural chemical intensity, casting a stark, dancing light across the field. Isabel and Alex burst from the trees. They were illuminated by the fire, their faces masks of sheer terror. Alex was stumbling, his weight almost too much for Isabel. Behind them, the pack of scrabblers skidded to a halt at the edge of the fire, chittering in rage and confusion. The searing light and heat were clearly a painful deterrent. The noctule, circling overhead, let out a frustrated shriek and veered away from the intense light. It's a perimeter, Kenji breathed, realizing what Owen had done. He had created a barrier, a wall of fire that the creatures were unwilling to cross. It will not hold them for long, Owen said, already moving back to the door. But it will buy us time. He slid open a series of heavy iron bolts on the door. Get ready. He swung the door open. Here, run, he bellowed into the night. Isabel saw him, saw the open door, the promise of safety. With a final, desperate burst of strength, she dragged Alex across the remaining distance and through the ring of fire. The scrabblers shrieked at their heels, darting at the edges of the flames, unwilling to follow. They stumbled into the cottage, Alex collapsing to the floor in a heap. Isabel fell to her knees beside him, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. Owen slammed the door shut behind them, the heavy bolts sliding home with a series of loud, definitive clunks. They were safe for now. Isabel looked up, her eyes wild. She saw Kenji on the cot, his leg bandaged. Her expression hardened, the terror replaced by a fresh wave of grief and anger. Maeve, she choked out. She's gone. They killed her. This is your fault. She pointed a trembling finger at Kenji. All of it, you and your damned ambition. Before Kenji could respond, a deep, earth-shaking roar echoed from the valley. It was closer than ever before. It was not a sound of frustration. It was a sound of approval, of a challenge being met. Owen stood by the window, peering out at the fire. "He is coming," he said quietly. "The gourmand. The bait was taken. The trap is sprung. Now the general comes to break the shield wall himself." The dog, which had been silent, began to whine, a low, fearful sound. It backed away from the door, its tail tucked between its legs. "The fire will not stop him," Owen continued. "He is not like the others. There is too much man in him, too much Roman. He understands fire, he understands war." He picked up the heavy crossbow, its silver-tipped bolt gleaming in the firelight. He looked from Kenji to Isabel, his expression colder and harder than the stone walls of his home. "You brought the cohort to my door," he said, his voice flat and final. "You will help me fight it." Chapter 9. The Siege of the Bothy. The fire Owen had created was a living, breathing thing. It hissed and spat in the damp air, casting the interior of the cottage in a frantic, strobe-like dance of orange and black. Outside, the scrabblers darted at the edge of the flaming circle, their pale forms monstrous in the flickering light. They were a pack of wolves held at bay by a campfire, their frustration audible in their chittering shrieks. But they did not retreat. They waited. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic stew of grief, blame, and terror. Isabel was still on her knees, her body racked with dry, shuddering sobs. The image of Maeve, defiant and doomed, was burned into her mind. Alex lay nearby, drifting in and out of consciousness, his shallow breaths ragged in the tense silence. Kenji, pushing through his own pain, had managed to sit up on the cot, his face a pale mask of guilt. Owen ignored the emotional wreckage. He was a man of action, his focus absolute. He moved to the hearth and picked up the short spear with the silver-colored head. He tested its weight, its balance, his movements economical and precise. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a man assuming an ancient, inherited duty. "Woman," he said, his voice sharp, directed at Isabel. "Mourning is a luxury for the living. Get up. You will be his undoing if you remain on the floor." Isabel looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "What's the point? We're all going to die here." "Perhaps," Owen conceded, his gaze unwavering. "But we will not die on our knees. The Black Eagle's creations, they feed on fear. Your weeping is a banquet to them." He tossed her a small, sharp knife from the table. "Make yourself useful. Cut strips from those blankets. We will need bandages and torches." The simple, direct order seemed to cut through Isabel's haze of despair. She fumbled for the knife, her hands still shaking, and began to cut the rough wool blankets, her movements becoming steadier, more focused with each slice. Kenji watched, a profound sense of uselessness washing over him. He was a scholar, a man of theory and intellect. Here in this primal conflict he was a liability, a wounded anchor. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice rough. Owen glanced at his bandaged leg. "You will load the crossbow, you will watch, and you will learn." He propped the heavy crossbow and the quiver of silver-tipped bolts against the cot within Kenji's reach. "When I fire, you will take the spent bow and give me a fresh one. You will do it quickly. Your life will depend on it." He had another crossbow, Kenji now saw, a slightly smaller one propped against the wall. A two-weapon rotation. This was not Owen's first siege. A new sound joined the crackling of the fire and the chittering of the pack. It was a heavy, rhythmic tread. Thump, crunch, thump, crunch. It was the sound of something massive, something deliberate, walking straight through the undergrowth, its path undeterred by the flames. "He is here," Owen said. He moved to the shuttered window, his spear held ready. The gourmand emerged from the woods. It walked into the ring of fire without hesitation. The flames licked at its thick, bristly hide, singeing the hair and revealing the scarred, grotesque flesh beneath, where Roman armor was fused into its very being. It seemed to feel the fire, but it did not care. It was an inconvenience, not a barrier. It strode through the flames and came to a stop just beyond the effective range of Owen's fire, a dark, hulking silhouette against the inferno. It did not immediately attack. It stood there, its massive boar's head turning slowly, surveying the cottage. Its intelligent eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent red in the firelight. It was assessing the fortress, studying its weak points, just as it had with the cabin. "It knows we are here," Isabel whispered, pausing her work. "It can see us." "It can smell us," Owen corrected. "It can smell your fear, it can smell his blood." He nodded towards Kenji. "And it can smell the iron, it is cautious. It remembers this place. It remembers my ancestors." The gourmand let out a low, rumbling grunt, a sound that was less a challenge and more a question. It took a step to the side, then another, circling the cottage slowly, always keeping its distance. The scrabblers mirrored its movement, a pale, skittering tide that ebbed and flowed with their commander. "It is looking for another way in," Kenji realized. "A weakness in the foundation, a chimney." "The stone is deep," Owen said, his voice a low murmur as he tracked the creature's movement through the window slit. "The chimney is barred with an iron grate. This house was built to withstand them." The gourmand stopped its circling. It stood directly before the front of the cottage, facing the heavy oak door. It lowered its head and a new sound filled the air, a deep, rasping noise. It was dragging one of its cloven hooves against the hard-packed earth, scraping a line in the dirt. Then it did it again, parallel to the first. And again. It was drawing in the soil, a pattern. Isabel crept to Owen's side, peering through the crack in the shutter. Her breath hitched. "My God," she whispered. "It's a tactical diagram. It's drawing a Roman infantry formation, the triplex Achai's." Kenji stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Isabel countered, her eyes wide with a horrified academic fascination. "The man he was, the centurion, his mind is still in there. The combat knowledge, the tactical training. Corvus didn't just fuse their bodies. He fused their minds, the predator's instinct and the soldier's discipline." As she spoke, the gourmand began to issue a series of sharp, barking grunts. The scrabblers responded instantly. They broke their loose circle and began to form up into 3 distinct lines, just as the diagram dictated. They were no longer a chaotic pack. They were a cohort of disciplined, monstrous infantry. "He's going to assault the door," Owen stated. His voice was grim, but Kenji could detect a note of something else in it, a warrior's respect. He was facing an intelligent enemy. The gourmand let out a sharp, commanding roar. The first line of scrabblers charged. They did not run at the door. They ran at the walls on either side of it, a pincer movement. They leaped, their claws finding purchase on the ancient, moss-covered stone, and they began to climb, their objective the roof. "They mean to collapse the roof," Owen said, "and come down on top of us." He grabbed the smaller crossbow, the one that was already loaded. The window. He threw open the shutter. A scrabbler, its face a mask of snarling teeth, was clinging to the wall just a few feet away, its black eyes fixing on him. Owen was faster. He raised the crossbow, aimed, and fired. The silver-tipped bolt struck the creature in the chest with a heavy thwack. The scrabbler did not scream. It convulsed. A strange blue-white energy like static electricity arced across its body, seeming to originate from the bolt. Its limbs went rigid and its grip on the wall failed. It fell, landing with a heavy, lifeless thump. The cold iron had worked. "Kenji, reload," Owen yelled, tossing the spent crossbow onto the cot. Kenji fumbled with the loading mechanism, his hands clumsy with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He had to use a crank to draw the heavy steel prod, a slow, arduous process. Owen was already at the other window, the one on the opposite side of the door. He smashed it open with the butt of his spear and fired his second, larger crossbow at another climbing creature. Another direct hit. Another convulsion. Another dead monster. He threw the second crossbow to Kenji. Faster. Kenji finally managed to seat a bolt in the first crossbow and handed it to Owen. The farmer took it, fired, and tossed it back. The cycle began. Fire, reload, fire, reload. It was a desperate, frantic rhythm against the chittering horde. The ground outside was becoming littered with the twitching, smoking corpses of the scrabblers. But there were too many of them. For every one Owen killed, another took its place. They were beginning to reach the edge of the roof. The gourmand, seeing its first wave falter, let out another roar. It was time for the second wave. But this wave did not charge the walls. It charged the fire. The scrabblers in the second line ran straight into the chemical flames, their bodies igniting like torches. They shrieked, a horrifying, piercing sound of agony, but they did not stop. They continued their charge, turning themselves into living firebrands, and slammed their burning bodies against the thick oak door. "He's using them as siege engines," Isabel gasped in horror. "He's sacrificing his own troops to burn through the door." The heavy oak began to smolder, the iron bindings glowing red-hot. The smell of burning flesh and ancient wood filled the cottage. The door, their primary defense, would not last long. Chapter 10. The Cold Iron. The heat pouring from the smoldering door was intense. The iron fittings glowed a malevolent cherry red, and the thick oak planks began to blacken and char. Smoke, thick with the smell of burnt hair and cooked meat, filled the small room, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. The shrieks of the burning scrabblers outside were a constant, agonizing symphony of death. "He's breaking us," Owen grunted, firing another bolt into a creature that was now trying to claw its way through the shuttered window. He was a machine, his movements precise and deadly. Fire, reload, fire. But Kenji could see the toll it was taking. Sweat beaded on the old farmer's brow, and his breathing was becoming ragged. "The door is failing," Isabel choked out, backing away from the heat. She was ripping one of the wool blankets into wide strips and soaking them in a bucket of water from Owen's cistern. Practicality had overcome her panic. "The bar will hold for a time," Owen said, not taking his eyes from the window. "It is iron." He dispatched another scrabbler. "But the smoke will kill us before the flames." The gourmand roared from outside, a sound of triumph this time. It knew it had found the solution. It had breached their defenses not with brute force, but with a horrifying, sacrificial tactic that spoke of a cold, Roman military logic. It was winning. Alex, the student, began to cough violently on the floor, the smoke making his already shallow breathing even more difficult. His life was now measured in minutes. "We have to get out of here," Kenji said, his voice raspy. He struggled to crank the heavy crossbow, his vision swimming from the smoke. "Is there another way out? A tunnel like at the bothy?" "No," Owen said, grabbing the reloaded weapon. "This place was built to be a final stand. There is no retreat from here." He paused, a grim understanding dawning on his face. "And he knows it." As he spoke, the gourmand charged. It did not hit the door, it hit the wall. The impact was like a car crash. The entire cottage shuddered, stone grinding against stone. Dust and ancient mortar rained down from the ceiling. A network of cracks appeared in the thick wall to the right of the fireplace. The gourmand was done with subtlety. It was now applying brute, overwhelming force. It struck the wall again. A huge, deep indentation appeared, the stones pushed inward. Another impact and a large section of the wall collapsed, sending a shower of stone and plaster into the room. A gaping hole, 5 feet wide, was now open to the night. The fire outside cast the gourmand's silhouette in the opening, a monstrous, demonic form framed by rubble and smoke. It stood there for a moment, its red eyes fixing on each of them in turn. Then it lowered its tusked head and stepped inside. The remaining scrabblers, their path now clear, abandoned their assault on the door and the roof and began to pour through the new breach. This was the end of the siege. Now it was a melee. Owen abandoned the crossbow. He grabbed the short spear with the silver-tipped head, its blade gleaming in the firelight. "Isabel," he yelled, "get the boy to the loft, now." Isabel, reacting on pure instinct, grabbed Alex under the arms and began to drag him towards the wooden ladder that led to the small sleeping loft. It was a desperate, flimsy hope of escaping the immediate slaughter. Owen planted his feet, the spear held in a two-handed grip, and stood between the breach and the loft ladder. He was a single, defiant old man against a tide of monsters, a scene from an ancient, forgotten epic. Kenji on the cot felt a surge of adrenaline cut through his pain and fear. He was not a warrior. He was not a protector, but he would not die helpless. He grabbed the remaining loaded crossbow. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely aim it. The gourmand was the target, the commander. Take out the head and the body might fall. The scrabblers surged forward. Owen met them with a fury that was terrifying to behold. He was not just a farmer, he was a descendant of warriors. The short spear was an extension of his body. He stabbed, he parried, he swept the blade in wide, deadly arcs. Each time the silvered iron connected with a creature, it convulsed and died, the strange blue energy arcing across its unnatural flesh. He was a whirlwind of cold iron and righteous fury, a bulwark of flesh and blood against the tide. But even as he fought, Kenji saw the gourmand. It was not charging, it was flanking. It moved with a terrifying, deliberate intelligence, using the chaos of the Scrabbler attack as a screen, moving along the wall to get a clear angle on Owen's unprotected side. "Owen, your left," Kenji screamed. Owen heard him. He half-turned, dispatching another Scrabbler, but the move left him momentarily off balance. It was the opening the gourmand had been waiting for. It charged. Kenji raised the crossbow. He had one shot. The creature was a huge target, but it was moving fast, and the room was a chaotic whirl of smoke and shadows. He ignored the Scrabblers, ignored the pain in his leg, and focused everything on the gourmand's massive, bristled shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. The bolt flew true. It struck the gourmand in the thick muscle of its shoulder with a heavy, meaty thud. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The gourmand roared, a sound of pure agony and shock. The blue-white energy of the cold iron did not just arc over its skin. It seemed to plunge deep into its body. The creature's massive form seized up, its muscles locking in a violent, full-body spasm. The Roman armor fused to its flesh glowed with a faint, pulsing light. For a moment, Kenji thought its very form was becoming unstable, as if the ancient energies that held it together were being short-circuited. It was wounded, badly, but it was not dead. The gourmand's roar of pain turned into one of pure, unadulterated fury. It ripped the crossbow bolt from its own shoulder with a spray of black, viscous blood. It turned its head, its red eyes ignoring Owen completely now, and fixed on Kenji. It had a new target, the source of its pain. Owen, seeing his chance, lunged forward while the gourmand was distracted. He drove his spear deep into the creature's exposed flank. The silvered head sank to the hilt. The gourmand bellowed, a sound of absolute agony. It swung a massive, backhanded blow, catching Owen in the side and sending him flying into the stone wall of the hearth. The old farmer crumpled to the ground, the spear ripped from his grasp, still embedded in the monster's side. Now, nothing stood between the gourmand and Kenji. The monster, grievously wounded, its body spasming, a spear sticking from its side, began to limp across the room. It ignored the fire, the remaining Scrabblers, everything. Its entire world had narrowed to the man on the cot who had heard it. Kenji scrabbled backwards, his hands searching for a weapon, for anything. There was nothing. This was it, the end of the line. The creature loomed over him, its hot, foul breath washing over his face. It raised a heavy, cloven hoof to crush his skull. Suddenly, from the loft above, a shape fell. Isabel, her face a mask of desperate courage, had climbed onto the crossbeams. She held a heavy, clay pot in her hands, one of Owen's incendiary devices she had grabbed from the table. She dropped it. The pot shattered on the gourmand's head. The sticky, chemical fluid splashed across its head and shoulders. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a stray spark from the fireplace ignited it. The gourmand's entire upper body erupted in a pillar of white-hot chemical flame. It shrieked, a sound that was no longer animal or human, but the sound of a soul being burned out of existence. It stumbled backwards, crashing through the ruined wall and out into the night, a running, screaming torch. It collapsed in the field outside, its death throes lighting up the valley before it finally lay still, a smoldering, black monument to its own profane existence. The remaining scrabblers, their commander destroyed, suddenly froze. Their chittering stopped. A visible confusion seemed to ripple through them. Their tactical discipline shattered. Without orders, they were just lost, confused things. They looked at the burning corpse of their leader, then at the humans in the cottage. Then, as one, they turned and fled, melting back into the darkness of the woods. The battle was over. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the ragged, desperate sound of their own breathing. Chapter 11. The Rot of the Earth. The dawn broke gray and weeping, the soft Welsh rain doing little to wash away the horrors of the night. The chemical fire had burned itself out, leaving a blackened, stinking circle in the field. At its center lay the charred, grotesque corpse of the gourmand, its form barely recognizable as anything that had once lived. The bodies of the scrabblers Owen had slain were scattered around the cottage like pale, twisted dolls. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket of shock and exhaustion. Inside the cottage, the scene was one of quiet devastation. Isabel had climbed down from the loft, her face smudged with soot, her eyes hollow. She moved with the slow, deliberate motions of a sleepwalker. She was tending to Owen. The old farmer was alive, but barely. He lay by the hearth, his breathing shallow, a dark, ugly bruise spreading across his side where the gourmand had struck him. Several of his ribs were clearly broken. Kenji had not moved from the cot. The adrenaline had worn off and the pain in his leg had returned with a vengeance, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to have a life of its own. But it was the guilt that was truly crippling him. He looked at the wreckage of the cottage, at the still form of the old man who had saved them, at the haunted look in Isabel's eyes. This was his creation. He had been the trumpet call. Alex, the student, was awake, his feverish eyes taking in the scene. He was quiet, his youthful bravado completely stripped away, leaving only a raw, shivering fear. "We have to get him to a hospital," Isabel said, her voice a dry rasp. She had managed to bind Owen's chest with strips of blanket, but it was a crude, insufficient measure. "He has internal injuries." "How?" Kenji asked, the single word encompassing the vastness of their predicament. "The vehicles at the site are probably destroyed. We have no communication. We're miles from the village and—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. "And the woods were still full of monsters." As if to punctuate his thought, a high-pitched shriek echoed from the distant hills. The noctule. It was still out there. And without the gourmand to command them, the remaining scrabblers were now a scattered, unpredictable threat. Leaderless, but still deadly. Owen's eyes fluttered open. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent a spasm of pain through his body. "No," he rasped, his eyes finding Isabel's. "No hospitals, they would not understand." He gestured feebly with one hand towards his worktable. "The pots, the iron, you have to burn them all, the bodies, everything." "We need to get you help," Isabel insisted gently. My help is here, Owen said, his gaze drifting towards the ancient stones of his hearth. My fight is over, yours is not. His eyes shifted to Kenji. A flicker of the old anger was there, but it was tempered with a weary resignation. You broke the seal. The rot of the earth is free. Burning the children will not put the father back in his tomb. The father, Kenji asked, leaning forward despite the pain. What do you mean? Corvus, Owen wheezed. He did not just create them, he became them. His final experiment was on himself. He bound his life to the hypogeum, to the energy of the place. He is not dead, he is waiting. A cold dread, deeper and more profound than anything Kenji had felt before, settled over him. They hadn't just unleashed a pack of monsters. They had awakened the monster maker himself. Legatus Vitalius Corvus, the Black Eagle, was still down there, a 2,000-year-old evil, and they had just cleared his front door for him. You have to seal the tomb, Owen whispered, his voice fatting. The capstone, the symbols, it must be sealed. He gripped Isabel's arm with a surprising strength. Promise me, seal the tomb. We promise, Isabel said, her voice thick with emotion. Owen seemed to relax. A small, faint smile touched his lips. Good, he murmured. His eyes closed, and with a final, rattling sigh, the last guardian of the valley was gone. The silence he left behind was heavier than any that had come before. He was a link to an ancient past, a living embodiment of the duty and sacrifice required to keep the world safe from its own forgotten nightmares. And now that link was broken. The duty was now theirs. For a long time, no one spoke. The finality of Owen's death was a weight that pressed down on them, crushing any hope that this was an isolated, containable incident. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about responsibility. Finally, Isabel stood up, her face set in a mask of grim determination. He was right, she said, her voice clear and strong. We have to go back. Back, Kenji stared at her. Back to the dig site. Are you insane? The place is crawling with those things. And at the heart of it is the source of the infection, Isabel retorted, her eyes flashing with a cold fire. Corvus. If he is down there, if he is the father Owen spoke of, then killing his children is pointless. More will come. We have to cut off the head. We have to seal the hypogeum. With what? Kenji demanded. Dunk is dead. Owen is dead. We are two scholars and a wounded student. We have a few crossbow bolts and some fire bombs. What can we possibly do? I don't know, Isabel admitted. But we are the only ones who can. We are the only ones who know the truth. If we run, if we somehow make it to the authorities, who will believe us? They will call it a wild animal attack, a gas leak causing hallucinations. They will send in another team and the cycle will start again. No, it ends with us. It has to. Her logic was inescapable. The guilt that had been eating at Kenji solidified into a hard, cold resolve. She was right. He had started this. He had to finish it. He owed it to Ben, to Dunk, to Maeve, and now to Owen. He looked at his leg. The wound was angry and inflamed, a network of dark veins spreading from the bite marks. A strange, cold numbness was creeping up from his foot. The rot of the earth, Owen had called it. He was infected. He didn't know how much time he had before the poison incapacitated him completely. "Okay," Kenji said, his voice steady. "Okay, we go back, but we do it my way, not as terrified survivors, as archaeologists. We have a site to analyze. The enemy has a history, a weakness. We will find it in Corvus's own words." He looked at Isabel. "His journal, the lead tablets. We need to read all of it. Every last word. The answer to how to kill the father is in the story of his own damnation." Chapter 12. The Vade Mecum of the Damned. Returning to the dig site was like walking back into a nightmare that had already happened. They moved at a crawl, a pathetic, limping trio. Isabel, with Alex leaning heavily on her, took the lead, her eyes constantly scanning the bruised sky for any sign of the noctule. Kenji followed, using one of Owen's heavy staffs as a crutch. The cold numbness in his leg had spread past his knee, and the flesh around the bite was a sickly, mottled gray. It was a race against the poison in his own veins. The site was a scene of quiet, rain-slicked carnage. The cabin was a wrecked shell. The generator was silent. A profound and unsettling stillness hung over the place. The scrabblers were gone, having dragged their dead away into the woods or back into the earth, leaving only deep, gouged tracks in the mud. The only body that remained was Dunk's, lying near the cabin's ruined doorway, a testament to his final, defiant stand. They paused, their heads bowed, a moment of silent respect for the man who had tried to protect them. Their destination was the technical tent. It was miraculously untouched, the creatures having focused their rage on the more solid structures. Inside, the equipment was all as they had left it. Isabel gently lowered Alex onto a camp bed, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Stay here," she commanded. "Don't make a sound." Kenji went straight for the steel case containing the artifacts they had recovered from the hypogeum. He laid the lead tablets out on the table, their surfaces covered in the dense, angry scratchings of Vitellius corvus. "We need power," he said. "The high-resolution camera, the spectral analysis software. It will be faster than trying to read this by eye." Isabel nodded, already at work on the silent generator. She was no mechanic, but she was methodical. The fuel line was intact, the engine undamaged. The problem was the main cable, chewed through by the scrabblers. With a roll of electrical tape and a multi-tool from Dunk's abandoned security locker, she began the painstaking work of splicing the thick copper wires back together. For an hour, the only sounds in the tent were the quiet clicks of Kenji, photographing the tablets and the grunts of Isabel's effort. Finally, with a prayer and a pull of the starter cord, the generator sputtered to life. The lights in the tent flickered on, and the hum of the computers was the most reassuring sound Kenji had ever heard. "Let's go to work," he said, uploading the high-resolution images. The Journal of Vitellius Corvus was more than a record of his experiments. It was a descent into madness. He wrote of his disdain for the weakness of humanity, his obsession with creating a new form of life, a perfect fusion of Roman discipline and animalistic fury. He detailed his early failures with a cold detachment, men torn apart by boar spirits that were too strong, others whose minds simply shattered, their bodies becoming little more than twitching meat. "He wasn't a general," Isabel murmured, reading over Kenji's shoulder as the translated text scrolled across the screen. "He was a eugenicist, a bioengineer born 2,000 years too early. They learned the secrets of his creations. The scrabblers were not just fused with badgers. They were bonded with the creature's instinct to burrow, to create a warren. The entire valley floor was now likely a honeycomb of their tunnels. The noctule was bonded with the bat's sonar, making it a perfect, unseen scout. The gorman had been his masterpiece, a fusion of his most loyal and brutal centurion with a creature Corvus revered for its sheer, indomitable rage. But it was the final entries that held the key. After creating the gormand, Corvus grew afraid. His creations were perfect, but they were not loyal. Their animal instincts, bound but not broken, were beginning to override their military conditioning. They looked at him not with a soldier's respect, but with a predator's cunning. He had become the zookeeper in a cage of his own making. "Listen to this," Kenji said, pointing to the last tablet. The script here was frantic, almost illegible. "My cohort has forgotten the eagle. They hear only the call of the blood and the earth. They see me not as their legatus, but as their jailer. They are a weapon that has turned on its own wielder. I cannot destroy them. They are my life's work, my children, but I cannot allow them to escape this valley. They would be a plague upon the empire." He trapped himself in with them, Isabel breathed. "More than that," Kenji said, scrolling down. "He needed a way to control them, to force their loyalty. He couldn't do it as a man." The final lines were a horrifying revelation, a recipe for apotheosis. The final vessel must be the alpha, not of boar nor of bat, but of all, the energy of this place. The genius loci. It does not reside in the earth. It is a presence, an intelligence, a god of the old blood. I will not pave it over. I will not bind it. I will consume it. I will become the god of this valley. The cohort will have no choice but to obey. I will become their imperator, their eternal commander." He performed the ritual on himself, Isabel whispered in horror. He tried to fuse himself with the very spirit of the land. "But something went wrong," Kenji said, pointing to the very last hastily scratched words. "Non deus est fames, not a god, but a hunger corpus. Carcer, the body, is a prison." The truth hit them with the force of a physical blow. Corvus hadn't become a god. He had become an engine of pure, insatiable hunger, a malevolent consciousness bound to the place, his human form a prison he could not escape. The magnetic anomaly Ben had detected was him, his life force, his rage, his endless hunger, trapped in a 2,000-year-old sarcophagus. The creatures were not just his soldiers. They were extensions of his will, his hands and claws in the world outside his prison. "How do we kill something like that?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. The answer was on another tablet, not part of the journal, but a page of notes from Hypatios, the Greek physician. It detailed the binding ritual, the delicate and dangerous interplay between Roman engineering and Celtic magic. "The hypogeum isn't just a laboratory," Kenji explained, his mind racing as he connected the dots. "It's a machine. The basalt walls, the metal fixtures, the channels in the floor, they aren't just for containing the creatures. They are for channeling the valley's energy, for focusing it." He pointed to a complex diagram. "And this is the heart of the machine. The main chamber, Corvus's tomb, but it has a safety protocol, a feedback loop." Hypatios, ever the cautious scientist, had built a fail-safe into his master's insane plan. If the fusion became unstable, the machine could be reversed. If you overload the system, Kenji read, the energy flow can be inverted. It would not just cut him off from the valley's power, it would pour it into him. All of it. It would turn his prison into a furnace. Overload it with what? Isabel asked. Kenji looked at the diagram again. There were 3 main conduits shown leading to the central chamber. At the end of each conduit was a symbol, a Celtic symbol. The Ogham stones, Isabel breathed. The standing stones on the hills around the valley. I thought they were just territorial markers. They're not, Kenji said, a wild, desperate plan forming in his mind. They are the circuit breakers, the regulators for the entire system. The Romans built the hypogeum right on the central nexus, but the power is drawn from the stones. He looked at Isabel, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity that had nothing to do with the poison in his leg. Corvus can't be killed. He has to be erased. We can't just seal the tomb. We have to destroy it. We have to turn his own machine against him. He stood up, leaning heavily on the staff. And to do that, we need to go back down. Chapter 13. A Descent into Hell. Leaving Alex was the hardest part. They gave him the last of their clean water and a canister of bear spray from Dunk's locker. If anything but us comes through that tent flap, you use this, Isabel instructed, her voice gentle but firm. The student nodded, his eyes wide with a terror that had become his permanent expression. Armed with their new knowledge, Kenji and Isabel headed for the pit. The gray morning light made the site look even more desolate. They carried Owen's remaining arsenal, the smaller crossbow for Isabel, the last 3 firebombs, and for Kenji, the heavy, silver-tipped spear which he now used as a crutch. His leg was almost completely numb, a dead weight he had to drag behind him. He knew time was running out. The entrance to the hypogeum was a black, gaping mouth. The foul, metallic smell still rose from its depths, a miasma of ancient death and contained evil. This time there was no hesitation. They were not explorers anymore. They were executioners. They descended the steep steps, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. The main chamber, with its vivisection table and monstrous mosaics, was just as they had left it, but it felt different now. It was not an empty room. It was a waiting room. They could feel Corvus's presence, a low, psychic hum that made the hairs on their arms stand up. He knew they were here. He was aware. The great stone door to the inner chambers stood open, a silent invitation. The corridor beyond was lined with the empty, silent cells. There was no sound, no sign of the scrabblers. "They've pulled back," Kenji whispered, his voice echoing in the stone hallway. "He's called them back to guard him." "Or he's setting a trap," Isabel countered, her crossbow held ready. They reached the heart of the complex, the large, circular chamber where Ben's readings had been the strongest. The air here was thick, heavy, and crackling with a strange energy. In the center of the room stood a massive, sealed sarcophagus of black basalt. It was this that the GPR had detected. It was carved with the same perverted symbol as the capstone, the eagle-headed Ouroboros. This was Corvus's prison, his throne. The floor around the sarcophagus was a complex network of channels, all leading to 3 larger conduits that disappeared into the walls. These were the channels that fed the energy of the valley into Corvus, sustaining him, connecting him to his cohort. and standing guard before the sarcophagus as still as statues were 4 scrabblers. They were not chittering or moving. They were simply waiting, their dead black eyes fixed on the intruders. "The fail-safe," Kenji said, his eyes scanning the walls. Hypatios's note said the activation point was in this chamber. He spotted it, a single, large, flat stone embedded in the wall, covered in a complex pattern of Celtic knots and Latin warnings. There, that's the control panel. To get to it, they had to go through the guards. Isabel raised her crossbow. She was a good shot, but 4 was too many. Before she could fire, Kenji held up a hand. "Wait," he pointed with the spear. "Look at them. They aren't just guarding him. They are connected." He was right. A faint, shimmering aura, barely visible to the naked eye, seemed to link the scrabblers to the sarcophagus. They were not just soldiers. They were terminals, physical conduits for their master's will. "If we kill them, he'll know our exact position, our intent," Kenji reasoned. "I have to get to that panel. You have to buy me time." "How?" Isabel asked, her voice tight with tension. "Create a diversion," Kenji said, handing her one of the firebombs. "Not here, back in the main corridor. As far from this chamber as you can get. The fire should draw them out." It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was the only one they had. Isabel nodded, her face pale but determined. "Be quick," she said, before turning and silently slipping back into the darkness of the corridor. Kenji waited. The 4 scrabblers remained motionless, their gaze fixed on him. He could feel Corvus's mind now, a cold, ancient intelligence studying him, probing his thoughts. It was not a voice but a feeling, a vast, arrogant amusement mixed with an endless, gnawing hunger. A muffled whoomp echoed from the far end of the complex, followed by the sudden, flickering orange glow of fire. Isabel had lit the bomb. For a moment the 4 scrabblers did not move. Then a silent command seemed to pass through them. Their heads all snapped in the direction of the fire. They let out a unified, chittering shriek and as one abandoned their post, scrambling back down the corridor towards the flames. The path was clear. Kenji half ran, half limped across the chamber, the spear scraping against the stone floor. He reached the control panel. It was not a simple switch. It was a puzzle, a series of concentric stone rings carved with Ogham symbols. He recognized the pattern from the notes. To invert the energy flow, he had to align the symbols in the correct sequence, the sequence that would sever the connection to the standing stones and create a feedback loop. His fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the heavy stone rings. The symbols were complex, worn with age. He could hear the shrieks of the scrabblers from the corridor. He didn't have much time. The first ring clicked into place. The low hum in the room intensified, a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the floor. The second ring. The air grew colder, and the faint aura around the sarcophagus began to glow more brightly. He was working on the third and final ring when he felt it. A change. Corvus was no longer amused. He understood what Kenji was doing. A wave of pure, psychic rage slammed into him, a force so powerful it made him stagger back, his vision blurring. A voice, ancient and corrupt, echoed directly in his mind, a voice made of grinding stone and decaying ambition. Insect, you think you can unmake a god. The scrabbler's shrieks from the corridor suddenly stopped. A new sound replaced them, the heavy, frantic scrabbling of claws, coming not from the corridor but from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The rest of the cohort, the burrowers, were converging on this chamber. They were coming through the stone. Kenji ignored the voice, the sounds. He focused on the final ring. He had the sequence memorized. He gave it one last, desperate twist. The final ring clicked into place. For a heartbeat, there was an absolute, profound silence. The humming stopped. The light faded. Kenji thought he had failed. Then, with the sound of a thunderclap that seemed to rip the very fabric of reality, the energy flow reversed. A blinding arc of pure, white-hot power erupted from the three conduits in the walls. It was not flowing into the sarcophagus. It was flowing out of it, a torrent of raw, uncontrollable energy. The fail-safe had worked. The machine was overloading. The lid of the basalt sarcophagus began to glow, first red, then white. The eagle-headed serpent symbol burned like a brand. The psychic scream from Corvus was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that transcended language. The body is a prison. Set me free. The walls of the chamber began to crack. The ground buckled. Stones rained down from the ceiling. The entire hypogeum was coming apart. Isabel appeared at the entrance to the chamber, her face wild with terror. Kenji, we have to get out. The whole place is collapsing. Kenji turned to run, but his poisoned leg gave way completely. He fell to the hard stone floor, the spear clattering from his grasp. The numbness was gone, replaced by a fire that was consuming his entire body. The rot of the earth was claiming him. I can't, he gasped, looking at his useless limb. I can't make it. Isabel ran to him, grabbing him under the arms. I am not leaving you here, she screamed over the roar of the collapsing tomb. She tried to drag him, but he was too heavy, and the shaking ground made it impossible. The sarcophagus was now glowing with the intensity of a small sun, the stone itself beginning to melt. The psychic screaming reached a crescendo that made their teeth ache. Go, Kenji commanded, his voice surprisingly firm. He found the spear and pushed it into her hands. Live, tell the story. Make sure they know what happened here. Make sure they remember their names. He looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in days, the fever of ambition replaced by the clarity of sacrifice. It's my fault, Isabel. Let me be the one to pay for it. Tears streamed down Isabel's face. She knew he was right. She could not save him. She could only save the story. She leaned down and kissed him, a quick, desperate press of her lips to his. Goodbye, Kenji. She turned and fled, not looking back, the silver-tipped spear of the last guardian in her hand. Kenji lay on the floor, the rumbling of the collapsing world his final lullaby. He watched as the great basalt sarcophagus finally gave way. It did not explode. It imploded, and then erupted in a silent, cleansing flash of pure white light that consumed everything. It consumed the chamber, the corridor, the mosaics, the memory of pain, and the last, terrified vestiges of the man who had been Vitellius Corvus. And as the light washed over him, Kenji Tanaka, the disgraced archaeologist, finally felt the poison in his veins burn away into nothing. Chapter 14. Epilogue: The Guardian of the Scar. 1 year later, a single woman stood on the Welsh hillside, looking down into the valley. The excavation site was gone. After the unexplained seismic event, the authorities had deemed the area geologically unstable. The entire pit had been filled in, covered over with tons of earth and rock, and seeded with grass. Nature was already reclaiming it. Wildflowers grew where the technical tent had once stood. It was a scar, but it was a healing one. Dr. Isabel Finch looked older than her years. There was a hardness in her eyes that had not been there before, but there was a strength, too. Alex, the student, had survived. His leg had healed, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He never spoke of what happened, and he never returned to archaeology. Isabel had kept her promise. She had told the story. Not to the authorities, not to the press. They would never have believed her. She wrote it down, a detailed, meticulous account, cross-referencing her own testimony with the translated texts of Corvus's journal and Owen's oral history. She called it the Vade Mecum of the Damned. She made 3 copies. One she sealed in a university vault to be opened a century after her death. The second she sent to a quiet, scholarly society in Rome that dealt with historical anomalies. The third she kept for herself. She was no longer just a historian. She had inherited a duty. She walked the perimeter of the filled-in site, her hand resting on the pommel of a heavy walking staff she now carried everywhere. It was Owen's staff. In her other hand, she held a single, silver-tipped crossbow bolt. The world did not know what lay buried beneath the green grass of the quiet Welsh valley. It did not know of the cohort of monsters, of the mad Roman general, or of the sacrifice that had been made to keep it safe. And that was as it should be. But some stories demanded a guardian, someone to watch over the scar, to ensure the wound never reopened, someone to remember the names of the fallen. A raven circled high overhead, its lonely cry echoing across the silent valley. Isabel watched it for a long moment, then turned and began the long walk back to the small, stone cottage she had purchased on the opposite ridge. The smoke from its chimney was a thin, gray line against the sky, a silent testament to a watch that would not end. The end.